Next on News Talk AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran, on with Alfred University professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Well, we've not had you on since the election last month. Wanted to get your thoughts on the election and the way it went.
Well, I was struck by something, not so much the results of the election, because I think that almost everyone who was, commenting on the election, kind of, aware of the public opinion polls and so forth, more or less knew what was going to happen. Not maybe with specificity, but, pretty much. After the election, the day after the election, I asked 56 students who were in classes that I teach in the field of history. I said, how many of you voted in the midterm election? And I'm going to ask you a question. How many of these students do you think voted?
Half?
0.
Really?
Not one.
Why?
Not one. Well, there are varied reasons. Some said, well, it was difficult to get an absentee ballot. Others said they didn't know how to get an absentee ballot. Of course, they didn't ask. They didn't make any real effort to do so. But the largest number kind of shrugged their shoulders. That is to say, they were saying, and they really said this, because we talked about it, they were saying that they did not feel that the election had any bearing on their lives. Or to put it slightly differently, they were indifferent. They didn't care which party won, and they did not believe that it made any difference to them as to which party won the election.
Even the history majors.
These are, some of them were history majors. Some of them were majoring in other fields, athletic training, psychology, business. In other words, my courses tend to bring in people from many, many different fields. But that level of non-participation, I think, is very, very dangerous. I think it's a warning for the future. Nationally, only 34% of registered voters voted in this midterm election. And while usually midterm elections have a much lower percentage than, let's say, a national election, not that much lower. In other words, we are turning off our population in respect to the very, very subject that we consider to be so very, very important, which is popular participation in the political process.
Why do you think that's happening?
I think it's happening for a number of reasons. But before I even mention that, there was a poll that I saw which I thought was kind of equally interesting. And it had to do with how much excitement, how much passion do you feel about the coming election? The percentage of people who replied positively was less than 30%, about 29%. So I think it kind of makes the point that, even people who do vote, at least some of them, are not voting with a lot of conviction. Why do I think it's happening? I think it's happening for a number of reasons. Number one, I think a lot of it has to do with the effect of money in politics. And think of these two things. There was the Koch brothers. They contributed monies to elections in 35 different states. And they did so from the highest levels, that is to say, contests for U.S. senator and for governors, to even local elections in some areas. And even, I think, more ominously, judicial elections. How much money did they give? About $120 million. In addition to that, the laws have been more or less redefined in such a way now that outside groups not contributing to a particular campaign, but, offering, if you will, their own position, can provide monies. We're talking about tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars in this last election, and we do not know who those outside groups are composed of. We don't know who contributed to the monies to these groups. They no longer have to specify that. Under certain conditions, individuals do if you contribute directly to a candidate or directly to a political party, but for these other kinds of campaigns, you no longer do. And so,
would voters 18 to 22 know that?
No, but they know that a lot, that there's a huge amount of money out there. When we're talking about $2 billion spent in the election cycle, think of myself, okay? I would often, in the past, I'd send some money to a political party. It might be $10. It might be $100. It might be $200, occasionally more, if I thought it was, important to me. But if the Koch brothers are spending $120 million. If Sheldon Adelson is spending $20 to $30 million, it just kind of dwarfs the meaning of that smaller campaign gift. And if you're not going to contribute, you have less of a sense of ownership, so to speak, of participation. So I think that's part of it. Secondly, we are all plenty aware, by golly, of negative advertising. And it's not stopping. We're getting more of it rather than less of it. And we're hearing it to the point where it just dulls our senses. It turns us off. It makes us less interested, so to speak, believing, let's say, that neither candidate has anything to offer. Well, the fact of the matter is that there's no fundamental difference between the candidates who are running today and the candidates who were running 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And yet, we know every little bit about these candidates today. Much of it, I might add, which is either exaggerated, and some of it which is false. But there's no check on this any longer, and consequently, this barrage of negative advertising, I think, turns off a large numbers of voters more and more in each election cycle. And so it creates a certain amount of skepticism, and that skepticism evolves into cynicism, and that cynicism is like a cancer. Okay. Eventually, people simply stop caring for, believing that they are responsible for their own political future.
You talk about voter apathy, and you say that this is even true among the younger voters. You'd be talking to 18 to 22, 18 to 24-year-olds. You say that 34%, only 34% voted nationally. You also mentioned the Koch brothers. I thought it was kind of interesting, and not to show for the Koch brothers, but one of them came out. There was a story, and I don't know if it was the New York Times or where I read this, but it said that one of the Koch brothers said, "We're criticized a lot from the left, but we're for gay marriage and abortion." Do they fund both sides? Do you know, Democrats and Republicans?
No, to my knowledge, they have only funded Republicans. Although I think what you just said is factually correct. They are not opposed to gay marriage, and I honestly don't know where they are in respect to pro-life, pro-choice, and so forth. But
I think they said they were for it.
That may well be. Yeah, I just don't know their position on that. But what I do know is that overwhelmingly, their funds have gone to fund not just Republican candidates, but conservative Republican candidates. And what that means also is that, those, let's call them moderate Republicans, we're seeing fewer and fewer of them. They're being knocked out in primaries, again, in part because people who feel really passionately on one side or the other are likely to come out for voting. And the people who are more moderate don't feel quite as strongly. How do you get someone to say, gee, you ought to fund that candidate who believes in compromise, in contrast to someone who's saying, Hillary Clinton is the Antichrist. One kind of, gets the juices going, and one does not. And yet, and why I think this is so important is that as a historian who kind of views not merely, the election of 2014 or 12 or 2008, but quite literally the elections that we have held in this country since 1790, okay? I think that the genius of American politics, and I want to repeat this, that the genius of American politics is compromise. It has been our willingness to compromise. And every so often that breaks down. A good example would be during the 1850s leading up to the Civil War, when the South was unwilling to compromise with the North, or for that matter, Lincoln was unwilling to compromise over the extension of slavery, and so we went to war. Another example would be over the issue of prohibition back during the late teens after the First World War. But that's the exception. Most of the time, Americans have been willing to compromise, and I think it creates another, or at least it leads to another related issue, which is an acceptance of the fact that people can legitimately disagree with you. The idea, in other words, that existed for, shall I say, 200 years, that we have a loyal opposition. 34% of the Republicans in a recent poll said that they think that the Democratic Party today is bad for America, which is a way of saying, in other words, that, the Democrats are not loyal. We're beginning, you see them as malign, okay, or even, I'm going to use a strong word, as evil, Okay, and I think that that too can be very, very corrosive. And you get a little bit of this on the far left as well, kind of in the other direction.
Wall Street, the Occupy Wall Street movement.
But, well, not so much. I'm thinking of, very, very liberal Democrats who may view the Republicans, the Koch brothers, for instance,
Sure.
as illegitimate. But the idea, for instance, that a Barack Obama, who's kind of a liberal, center left, okay, and I think I can argue that case pretty well here. But that he is so somehow bringing down America, or that he was put here by evil unknown forces, to take down America, literally to take down America. I think that's destructive. I think that it's not simply wrong, but I think that it really, in some ways, diminishes what we are politically.
We're talking with Alfred University Professor of History, Dr. Gary Ostrower. When we get back, the U.S. Senate Torture Report and Ferguson. Back on the Newsmaker Show, Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Dorn. We're talking with Alfred University History Professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Gary, in the last segment, you mentioned Hillary Clinton. Will the next Democrat candidate be Hillary Clinton or Elizabeth Warren?
Hillary Clinton.
Why?
Because if you want to win an election, and the Democrats are going to want to win this election, you elect or that you nominate people that are much more characteristic of the center than they are of the fringe of a party. But there's one thing that makes me a little bit dubious. In other words, I give myself the right to be wrong.
Go ahead.
And I think you see this on the Republican side with people like Ted Cruz and so forth. The people who come out in primaries tend to be the real, how shall I put it, the those who feel the strongest, who are the passionate. Or to put it differently, those folks who are not coming out to support the candidates willing to compromise. People who are, in other words, want to vote their principles without any exception, that is to say, without any hint of compromise. And I think we're going to find more of them in the Democratic Party than we have in the past. But I think the Democrats are going to want to hold the White House, especially in light of the fact that the Republicans hold the Senate and the House of Representatives. And for that reason, I think that Hillary Clinton is going to get the nomination.
You indicate that Hillary's more center, Elizabeth Warren more left. Why is it that the conservatives, the Tea Party conservatives, don't go after or criticize Elizabeth Warren as much?
Well, I suspect it's because they don't view her as much of a threat to become the next president of the United States. And I think if she became a really, really strong candidate, you'd hear a great deal of comment about her.
Because I hear my liberal friends talking up Elizabeth Warren much more than they do Hillary. There's a little disappointment there with Hillary from my far liberal friends.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, Elizabeth Warren really represents that left-wing section of the Democratic Party. It's difficult to get excited, really excited about someone in the center. And that's why, there's not a lot of excitement about Jeb Bush on the Republican side. There's certainly not a lot of excitement about Hillary. And also, and I think this is important, Hillary is a known quantity. Elizabeth Warren is kind of new. She kind of brings in a certain, there's an excitement factor there, a novelty factor. And that probably also helps to explain, at least in part, why there is, less enthusiasm about Hillary. But Hillary has a lot of smarts. She is not taking positions, and this may hurt her in some areas, but, that are going to alienate the center of American politics. So that, for instance, in respect to foreign policy, she's not way out there arguing that we should remove all of our troops from the Middle East and become not involved at all with, whether it's, drone warfare or whatever. In other words, she's fairly conventional in her politics. We know, the United States is not going to disappear if Hillary Clinton wins this election. So, you kind of take it for granted and then you focus on the new person on the block.
You brought up drones a moment ago, the U.S. Senate's torture report. Wondering your thoughts first, and then what do your students say about torture?
I'm going to disappoint you on the student side. They haven't mentioned it, and that's in part because just when the report came out, my students were going into a final examination period and
they got other things to focus
they got
on.
other things is right. So they were really preoccupied. If they think about anything else, it's likely to be the Buffalo Bills. But on the torture side, I think more generally, what I've certainly read is kind of dismaying. It's somewhat shocking. We've known a good deal of this. It's not as if all of this is new material. What disappoints me is the reaction against the report. The report is, I've read portions of the report. The report is 580 pages. I read about 20 pages, so I don't want to sound as if I really know what I'm talking about here. But I know enough to say that what the report argues is not really it's the factually there's really no question that what they're saying is true. Okay, and even John Brennan, the head of the CIA, when he gave a very unusual press conference just a couple of days ago, even he did not quarrel with the factual premises of the report. He even argued. He even said that what we did was abhorrent. Okay, was hateful, was abhorrent, which I certainly did not anticipate that he would say. On the other hand, I also watched Dick Cheney recently on Meet the Press, and Cheney is unrepentant. He will give not an inch. And the way he begins his defense is simply by saying it's not torture. So you play around with language. You claim that we call this enhanced interrogation techniques. That's a euphemism. It means torture. So let's call torture what it is. But he refuses to admit that it's torture, and he even refuses to admit that what we did was in any way a violation of international law or of our own anti-torture legislation. So, for instance, we claim that waterboarding was torture after the Second World War. The Japanese had waterboarded American prisoners of war, and that was widely accepted. And not just widely accepted that they had done it, but widely accepted that it contravened, that it was a violation of the laws of war. That's no small thing. It was a violation of the laws of war. Well, we did exactly the same thing after 2001. And Cheney, for instance, is arguing that, it's not torture. And, but we say it's the same thing. It's waterboarding is waterboarding. And he's saying, no, it's not torture. Well, why is it not torture? Because the Department of Justice says it isn't torture. A very conservative Republican by the name of Jack Goldsmith, who is a constitutional lawyer, teaches at the Harvard Law School, conservative guy, and he served as President Bush's the head of the Office of Legal Counsel during the early and the mid 2000s, the first decade when Bush was president, resigned his office because out of frustration and on principle in opposition to the use of torture, to the way in which the CIA was operating. Is the CIA kind of out of control that way? Yeah, the answer is yes, but it's also being justified. It's being legitimized, so to speak, by some of the other offices in the U.S. government. And I might add, by the way, that even President Obama, perhaps for political reasons rather than for anything else, has refused to argue, for instance, that the people who did this should be prosecuted.
Another big issue we have not heard from you on yet, because you haven't been on during this time period, Ferguson and the Eric Garner case in New York City and the protests afterwards. Did you have any thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, I guess I was a little bit surprised that it took so long before we saw this kind of a protest. Look, I think that everyone understands that there is a difference in the way in which let's say a black teenager is likely to be treated than a white. Okay, and you can argue that, well, wait a minute, black teenagers certainly in cities are committing more crimes than white, but that's not the issue. It's the way in which they are treated. And in that sense, I think that the protests are probably deserved. I think that Dr. Heinemann made a point on this program just about a week ago or so that, look, we have a constitutional right to protest. It's built into the First Amendment, and no one should in any way challenge that. Is there justification for the police to do what they did? Minimally, let's have a trial. Let's have a real trial. And a grand jury proceeding is not a real trial. someone once said, a judge actually here in New York State, once said that a good prosecutor can indict in a grand jury how did he put it?
A ham sandwich.
A ham sandwich. Well, what you had, for instance, in Ferguson in the recent grand jury proceeding was the prosecutor who, by the way, his father, if I'm not mistaken, was killed by a black teenager. Okay, so, let's say neutrality is not his strong suit. He didn't, offer the evidence to basically, indict. What he said is, I will let the grand jury see all of the evidence. Now, my hunch is that the officer, Wilson, would never have been convicted. But that there should have been a trial, you bet there should have been a trial. And I think that what happened in New York, in Staten Island, was even worse because we see what happened. It was,
It was on YouTube.
Oh, it was awful. The use of excessive force was, and you could hear the young man, not the young man, but you could hear the fellow saying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And they still did not release him from that chokehold. Is that night indictable? Oh, well, you can draw your own conclusion.
Final question for you, Dr. Gary Ostrower. You mentioned Obama and socialism earlier in the show. That's something that you hear a lot. In fact, he made a joke once, I'm not the strapping young Islamic communist that I used to be. Is he a socialist?
Absolutely not. But you have to know what a socialist is. If you say that a socialist is anyone who supports even a little bit of government regulation, well, then I suppose he's a socialist. But here's a guy, for instance, who saved General Motors in 2009, bailed out General Motors. The government took over about 85% of the stock, of the shares of General Motors, and then 4 years later, at a profit, sells that back to the corporation, sells it back to the directors, sells it back to the private shareholders. No socialist is going to do that. Obama could have nationalized the banks in 2009. We were in such bad shape. And yet he, didn't touch that. He walked away from it. Obama could have supported a single-payer health plan system. He did not. He brought the insurance companies, the private companies, which are really making a great, killing under Obamacare. He brought them right into the whole system and so forth. There is so much evidence that he is not a socialist. A socialist being, in other words, someone who wants to abolish private property. That's what a socialist is. Obama is no socialist.
Dr. Gary Ostrower, any final thoughts before we go?
Nice to be back. Good to see you.
Great to have you in here. Dr. Gary Ostrower, professor of history at Alfred University. Thanks for coming in.
Merry Christmas.
And a happy Hanukkah.